Up next, part one of a two-part special series on Montgomery County during the Civil War. Stay tuned. Welcome to Paths to the Present. I'm Barbara Grunbaum, standing in for Gail Street. To commemorate the sesquicentennial of the American Civil War, Paths to the Present is taking a look at life in Montgomery County during that time period. Produced in conjunction with Heritage Montgomery, this show takes a look at the events of the war that touched close to home. In 1861, Montgomery County was home to a little over 18,000 people, a people sharply divided in its loyalties. By a 2-vote margin, it was decided that Montgomery County should express sympathy for fellow Southerners, but encouraged the state to make every effort to preserve the Union. After Fort Sumter was fired upon in April and Virginia seceded 5 days later, state legislators took up the debate. In the end, the state of Maryland took no action to join the Confederacy, which worked to the Union's advantage. This is how the state of Maryland, and Montgomery County in particular, became a strategic component in our nation's bloodiest war. President Lincoln knew that the land east of the Potomac River was all there was between the openly rebelling states and our nation's capital. He called for it to be secured at all costs. A myriad of transportation routes already existed in Montgomery County, increasing the city of Washington's vulnerability. There were ferries and fords all along the Potomac River, making it easy to travel to and from Virginia. The recently completed Chesapeake and Ohio Canal was important for getting supplies in and out of Washington, and a network of roads connected the county's communities to one another. When federal troops were dispatched to occupy strategic points in Maryland, many were sent to Montgomery County. By the end of June 1861, 10,000 Union soldiers had encamped at the fairgrounds on Rockville Pike near St. Mary's Church, where Richard Montgomery High School stands today. An even larger number of federal troops moved into Poolesville, where residents were more closely aligned with their neighbors in Virginia. This town of only about 250 people was overwhelmed by the Union presence. A military telegraph was connected to Poolesville, and troops were stationed at Great Falls, Seneca, Middlebrook, and Darnestown.
Oh, ladies.
But there were threats from within as well. Maryland was a divided state. Unionists, slave owners, and even slave owners who supported the Union lived side by side. It was hard to know whom to trust. Martial law was established. Residents could be searched without reason and thrown in jail for no cause. All to protect the capital city of Washington from Confederate attacks. Many consider the First Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861 to be the official start of the war. But the occupation of Montgomery County had already begun. Then, no one knew what was to come. Only now do we know that this was the beginning of the bloodiest war to be fought on American soil. Just before the Civil War, a little over 18,000 people were living in Montgomery County. 1/4, or about 4,500, was African American. Of that number, approximately 1/3 were free. The rest were enslaved, working as farmhands, household servants, or craftsmen. One of this county's most famous slaves was associated with the building you see behind me. Today, this log cabin in North Bethesda is surrounded by suburbia, but in the 1800s, it was part of the Riley Farm. Josiah Henson was enslaved here for more than 30 years. In 1830, Henson fled to Canada, became a minister and a writer. His autobiography inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1852 novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. While this particular log cabin was built after Henson fled, it is all that is left of the farm where he lived and worked as a slave.
There ain't no freedom.
Josiah Henson was able to escape the Riley Farm thanks to the Underground Railroad. This was a secret alliance of people who helped conduct freedom seekers on their journey northward. Assisting enslaved people to escape was illegal. No records were kept, but it's believed that the Underground Railroad operated for decades prior to the start of the war and passed through Montgomery County. The Quakers of Sandy Spring, who had freed their slaves 50 years earlier, were probably active in this movement. One stop was likely the stone bank barn at Woodlawn Manor in Sandy Spring. Another is thought to have been in the basement of the original Christ Episcopal Church in Rockville. In a state where slavery was legal, roughly 1/3 of Montgomery County landowners held slaves. Those who sympathized with the South were at odds with the invading Union soldiers. But people of color heralded the federal troops for their promise of a better future. Encampments offered a tempting refuge. Responding to the concerns of local slave owners, federal officers were forced to order their men to turn in any contraband. Captured runaways were often held at the jail in Rockville. By late 1861, the Union had established a significant presence along the Potomac River. They were sent here to guard Montgomery County's vulnerable border. And it wasn't long before an encounter occurred not far from here, just across the river. The Battle of Ball's Bluff took place on October 21, 1861. Union regiments led by Colonel Edward Baker ferried across the Potomac to scale some steep cliffs, known as Ball's Bluff. A timely Confederate counterattack left Baker dead and forced the Federals to retreat. More than 700 Union soldiers were captured, and many more died trying to escape. As the year wore on, Federal troops were ever present in this part of the county. In addition to the Union camps, a military infrastructure was developing. Professor Thaddeus Lowe created a balloon camp in the hills above Edwards Ferry. Weather permitting, gas-fired balloons ascended to provide a clear view of enemy activity in the surrounding area. Because balloons were hard to conceal, the Confederates adjusted their tactics, and the camp was closed after only 4 months. In Darnestown, along Seneca Road, a Signal Corps school was established on the Samuel T. Magruder farm. Platforms placed in a chestnut tree supported signalers with flags. Coded messages were sent through a network of signalers stationed at other high places. One was atop Sugarloaf Mountain. In southern Darnestown, the hills overlooking the Potomac offered a good vantage point for surveying enemy activity. In the fall of 1861, 5,000 Federals encamped here. A few months later, the 19th Massachusetts Infantry erected 3 blockhouses for maintaining a secure lookout between Seneca and Great Falls. Each was 48 feet square, with walls 4 feet thick and 12 feet high. Federals occupied this area for the duration of the war. Welcome to Violet's Lock, one of 74 locks found along the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. Today, the C&O is our longest national park. It runs nearly 184 miles from Georgetown to Cumberland, Maryland. It draws close to 4 million visitors each year. But during the Civil War, this was an important supply line for the Union Army. At the outset of the war, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal had just been completed. Comprised of a series of locks, aqueducts, and culverts to accommodate changing elevations, the C&O was a critical transportation link to and from the Port of Georgetown. The city of Washington depended upon it, which is why Confederates disrupted sections whenever they could. This is the recently restored Monocacy Aqueduct. Today it's a great place to hike or boat, but during the Civil War, it survived at least 2 known attempts by rebel soldiers to destroy it with explosives. Because the canal runs alongside the Potomac, all troops crossing the river, Union and Confederate, also had to cross the canal. The sheer numbers caused ongoing destruction. Prior to the war, the ferry that operated here at Edwards Ferry connected Virginia to Maryland. The canal is just up the hill, along with the remains of a small town. Union forces camped here throughout the war. In October 1861, Edwards Ferry was the site of a makeshift hospital that cared for soldiers wounded in the Battle of Ball's Bluff. One was a young Oliver Wendell Holmes. And in 1863, prior to the Battle of Gettysburg, General Joseph Hooker and his Army of the Potomac crossed the river into Maryland, here at Edwards Ferry, using 2 1,400-foot-long bridges that Union engineers had constructed from pontoons. The physical impact of this crossing on the canal and the surrounding area was enormous. Although Maryland was controlled by the Union, It remained a slaveholding state for most of the war. Montgomery County was especially affected. The citizens in the northwestern portion tended to sympathize with the South, but folks with Confederate leanings could be found all over.
We look like men.
The editor of the Sentinel newspaper, Matthew Fields, repeatedly ran fiery articles to champion the Southern cause, which in later years landed him in prison. Montgomery County native turned Confederate spy, Rose O'Neill Greenhow, used her feminine wiles to collect information on Union plans, which she then passed on to leaders in the Southern Army. While there were men in the county who enlisted with the Army of the North, many others went south to fight with the Confederates. Ridgely Brown was one of them. Born near the town of Sunshine, he helped organize the 1st Maryland Cavalry. Elijah Veers White is one of this county's most famous rebels. A native of Poolesville, he moved across the river to Loudoun County just prior to the war. White rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel in the Confederate Army. This was a popular crossing point connecting Poolesville to Virginia. A ferry has operated at this site since 1786. During the war, it was known as Conrad's Ferry. In later years, it was renamed for Colonel Elijah White, who purchased it soon after the war. Many of Colonel White's compatriots are buried here, in the Monocacy Cemetery in Bellsville. The church that originally stood here was destroyed when Yankees used the pews for firewood and the chapel itself for a stable. In 1913, the chapel was rebuilt as a memorial to the local Confederates who gave their lives in this war. Their names are listed on this tablet, and Southern crosses mark their graves. In 1862, as summer was coming to a close, the Confederacy launched its first major invasion of the North, known as the Maryland Campaign. General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia began moving into Maryland. The plan was to reach Pennsylvania and damage Northern morale in anticipation of the November election. Here on the Potomac River, just north of White's Ferry, is White's Ford. It got its name because Elijah White's Loudoun County farm was on the opposite shore. This is where, at certain times of the year, it's possible to wade across the Potomac. In fact, General Robert E. Lee and 35,000 men crossed here as part of the Maryland Campaign. They didn't know it yet, but they were headed towards the bloodiest single-day battle in American history, the Battle of Antietam. While Lee was moving into Maryland, Union General George McClellan and the Army of the Potomac passed through Rockville. McClellan spent the night of September 7, 1862, at the home of the Bell sisters. Their home, known today as the Bell Dawson House, is exhibit space for the Montgomery County Historical Society. As the armies advanced, troops from both sides fanned out across western Montgomery County. During the days leading up to the battle, clashes between Union and Confederate soldiers erupted in communities from Poolesville to Comus. On September 9, 1862, the tiny town of Barnesville experienced the war firsthand. Cavalries from Illinois and Virginia clashed repeatedly in and around the town. They charged back and forth along the main road, forcing townsfolk to hide in their cellars. By the end of the day, the rebels retreated, but not before the town had changed hands 5 times. 8 days later, Lee and McClellan met at Antietam in Washington County near Sharpsburg. Together, both sides suffered more than 23,000 casualties. Lee retreated the following day, ending the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia's first invasion into the North. While not a stunning victory for the Union, the Battle of Antietam did repel the Confederate Army. Lincoln decided to act. 5 days after the battle, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which was adopted on the first day of January 1863. This important document substantially expanded the character of the war to include freedom for all. A future episode of Paths to the Present will pick up where this one left off, bringing you more on life in Montgomery County during the Civil War. I'm Barbara Grunbaum. Thanks for watching.